How many of you have ever thought about how important Florida's coastline was during the Civil War? I mean, we've got over 1,400 miles of it, and trust me, it played a huge role back in the 1860s when the Union Navy was trying to stop the Confederacy from getting supplies. Ever heard of blockade running? Hey, y'all. Welcome back to Old Florida Now. I'm Bo Carter, and let me just say it's great to have you with me today as we dive into some seriously fascinating Florida history. This is the second episode in our Florida's Role in the American Civil War series. Today, we're talking about those daring, dangerous efforts to smuggle goods in and out of Florida during the Civil War, all while the Union Navy was trying to stop them at every turn. This might seem like a side note in the bigger war, but honestly, it was a massive part of the fight.
From Okeechobee ripples to the Gulf breeze, land of whispers, Spanish moss in the trees, the swamps, oranges and pirate wars embrace. Florida's history, we set the pace.
Okay, so let's set the stage a little. Back in 1861, when the Civil War first kicked off, President Abraham Lincoln decided to issue a blockade on the southern states, which had seceded, and this naval blockade called the Anaconda Plan was meant to basically strangle the Confederacy by stopping any trade from going in or out. Think about it. No weapons, no food, no medicine. It was like trying to, cut off the blood supply to a limb. Florida was a key part of that blockade. With its huge coastline, it was like a natural haven for blockade runners. They knew the waters. They had the fast ships, and, well, they were motivated. The Confederate economy was crumbling, and these runs were one of the only ways they could get supplies. Now, back then, the Union Navy didn't have much to work with. They had, a few ships patrolling thousands of miles of coastline. Seemed like an impossible task at first. And for the Confederates, running the blockade was high stakes, high reward. So here's where it gets interesting. The Confederate side didn't have massive warships built for battle. They had these fast, nimble ships. Most of them were steam-powered and had really shallow drafts, so they could navigate Florida's tricky waters. They were built for speed, not combat, A lot of these ships were built in Britain, actually, and painted dark colors like gray or black. So they'd blend into the water at night. These ships could dart in and out of inlets and rivers like Matanzas Inlet, which is just south of St. Augustine. And, well, it wasn't just guns and ammo these blockade runners were bringing in. They also carried luxury items, things like silk, cigars, even whiskey. Now, let me tell you, the Confederates were hurting for supplies, so everything they could bring in was precious. But here's the kicker. Those ships had to make multiple runs for it to be really profitable. One successful trip wouldn't cut it. They'd have to dodge the Union Navy over and over again. And with each trip, the risk got higher. Now, the Union Navy wasn't just sitting around twiddling their thumbs either. After those first few months of chaos, they started beefing up their forces big time. So, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy at the time, he got Congress to approve a huge expansion of the fleet. They bought civilian ships, turned them into warships, and built dozens of new vessels from scratch. By the end of the war, the Union had like over 600 ships in the water. That's a huge jump from the 3 or 4 ships they started with. The East Gulf Blockading Squadron, stationed out of Key West, was responsible for patrolling Florida's waters. These folks worked some long, boring shifts out there, going back and forth along the coast, just waiting to catch a runner. And, yeah, it might sound like a drag, but the payoff, the payoff could be huge. You see, like if they captured a blockade runner, they could like auction off the cargo and split the prize money. There's one story about a Union ship, the Eolus, that captured the blockade runner, Hope. The captain walked away with like $13,000 in prize money. That's over $250,000 in today's money. But, it wasn't just about the money. There was a whole tactical side to it, too. Blockade runners knew the Union Navy was after them, so they used some pretty clever tactics to get around them. They'd run at night, for one. They'd also sometimes fly false flags, posing as neutral ships to fool Union patrols. And if they were about to get caught, they'd dump their cargo overboard, try to slip away, and hope to retrieve it later. Some even had retractable smokestacks, so they could lower them and reduce their visibility. Pretty smart, right? There was also this backdoor approach to St. Augustine through Matanzas Inlet. It was less obvious and not as heavily patrolled, which made it perfect for slipping in and out without drawing too much attention. I love this story about the Union Navy catching a ship there, the British Empire. They rowed 18 miles south, boarded it, and seized the cargo. The ship itself, well, it was old and leaky, so they figured the best course of action was to sell the cargo to relieve the distress of the people in town. Pretty wild, right? Now, you might be wondering, okay, Bo, how did this all end? Well, as the war went on, the Union's blockade got tighter and tighter. The Confederacy was getting squeezed. They relied so much on these blockade runners, but by 1864, only the fastest, most well-built ships were still getting through. The Union Navy had, learned all their tricks by then. Plus, with more ships patrolling the Gulf and the Atlantic, it was a lot harder to slip by. In fact, some of the last major attempts at blockade running happened right here in Florida. The Union caught ships like the Araneta, which was trying to make it through Matanzas Inlet with percussion caps, salt, and cotton. By that time, the blockade runners were taking whatever they could get, but the Union was intercepting a lot more. Oh, and let me tell you about some of the famous ships and people involved. There was this ship called the CSS Robert E. Lee. I know, right? Named after the Confederate general. It was one of the fastest blockade runners, and it managed to make 21 successful runs before it was captured. Then you had ships like the CSS Advance, which made 17 runs before being caught. But the people behind the scenes were just as interesting. One of the biggest players was Captain John Newland Maffitt. He commanded the CSS Florida, one of the most successful Confederate blockade runners. Under his leadership, they captured and destroyed tons of Union merchant ships, making life really difficult for the Union Navy. It was a real game of cat and mouse, and both sides were pushing the limits of their technology and strategy. And look, it's easy to talk about the ships and the tactics, but let's not forget the human cost here. These crews on both sides, they were risking their lives with every run. For the Confederates, running the blockade was a lifeline. They needed those supplies to keep the war going. For the Union sailors, catching a blockade runner wasn't just about the prize money. It was about weakening the South, one intercepted shipment at a time. By 1865, when the war finally ended, Florida's ports were largely shut down. The Confederacy was running on fumes, and the blockade was a big reason for that. So yeah, blockade running might not have the same spotlight as, say, the big land battles like Gettysburg or Antietam, but here in Florida, it was everything. It's one of those chapters in history where, the action was right off our shores. Next time you're at the beach, just picture those small steamers zipping by at night, dodging Union ships, trying to get one more load of supplies through. It's wild to think about. Now, when I look back at Florida's role in the Civil War, especially with this whole blockade running business, well, it strikes me how much resilience and grit it took for both sides, really. Those Confederate sailors risking it all to sneak past Union ships, and the Union Navy out there in the heat and the boredom waiting for them. I'll tell you this, coming from a place like I did where, community means everything, it kind of makes me think about the bigger picture here. You had Floridians on both sides, mind you, risking their lives, fighting for what they thought was right. And that's something that's always going to hit me deep, because when push comes to shove, it's about protecting what you love, right? But here's the thing. I wonder sometimes if folks back then in the middle of it all ever stopped to think about the cost of it, the toll it took on the land, the people, the communities. Sure, they were smuggling in supplies, but at what cost? Did they ever think about the long game? The fact that no matter who won, the scars from all that fighting would be around for a long, long time. Growing up, we had this saying, you can't fight the river. And in a way, that's how I think about the blockade too, the Union Navy. Well, they were like the river, slow and steady, always pressing forward. And the runners, as daring as they were just trying to ride the current. But eventually, that river was going to win out. The blockade did its job. The Confederacy was starved out bit by bit, port by port. So I guess what I'm getting at is resilience is one thing, but there's a difference between stubbornness and survival. And I think we can all learn something from that. Sometimes you got to know when to hold the line, and sometimes you got to know when to let go and change with the tide. Anyway, that's just where my mind goes when I think about it. The way history flows through a place like Florida, and how in the end, it's the land and the people who stick around long after the battles are done. But hey, that's just what I think. Maybe I've been staring at those slow rivers a little too long. What about y'all? You ever think about how the past still ripples through places today? It's kind of wild to me, but I guess that's why I keep coming back to these stories. It keeps me curious. All right, y'all. Before we wrap up today's deep dive into blockade running and the Union Navy's efforts here in Florida, and I want to share some resources for those of you who want to dig a little deeper into this fascinating piece of history. First off, if you're in Florida or planning a visit, I'd recommend checking out the Castillo de San Marcos National Monument in St. Augustine. The site played a key role during the Civil War, especially as a spot for Union forces to tighten their grip on the blockade. The National Park Service has some great info about blockades at Matanzas Inlet and how blockade runners tried to sneak through there. You can check out their website for more details. Another great resource is the Museum of Florida History. They've got an entire section on naval and riverine operations during the Civil War, which covers how blockade runners operated and how the Union Navy worked to stop them. It's a great starting point if you want to understand more about Florida's role in the war. If you're more into reading online, the American Battlefield Trust and the Civil War Academy both have some solid articles about famous blockade runners and the tactics they used to outwit the Union Navy. You'll get a sense of the high stakes involved and just how fast these ships had to be to survive. And the Palm Beach County Historical Society blog has a cool article about blockade running around Jupiter Inlet, detailing some exciting captures made by Union ships in that area. I'll link to all that in the show notes. So go ahead and dive into those resources and let me know what y'all find interesting. History is all about digging a little deeper, right? Thanks for sticking with me on this one, folks. I'm Bo Carter, and I'll catch y'all next time on Old Florida Now.